December 1986, Shindan Air Base, Western Afghanistan. The dawn is a pale, frozen blue. At the largest Soviet airbase in Afghanistan, the morning patrols of Mi-24 Hind helicopters have already returned, their rotors slowing to a tired whump, whump, whump. On the perimeter, conscripts in bulky overcoats stamp their feet against the cold, their breath forming small clouds. The air traffic control radar at the heart of the complex sweeps its electronic gaze across the known approaches. It sees nothing, because the threat is not coming from the horizon. At 8,000 feet, a tiny, strange shape drifts on the thin, cold air. It is 16 feet long, with a wingspan of just under 17 feet. It weighs 450 pounds. Its body is a skeletal frame of fiberglass and Kevlar. A modified lawnmower engine purrs quietly, pushing it at a leisurely 90 knots. It carries no pilot, no weapons. Its only payload is a stabilized gyroscopic television camera, its lens focused intently on the ground below. It is the CIA's newest asset, the Pioneer Unmanned Aerial Vehicle. From this silent, unpiloted perch, the camera drinks in the details of Shindan. It records the hardened aircraft shelters, their massive concrete arches housing rows of Sukhoi Su-17 fighter strike aircraft and MiG-23 floggers. It notes the positions of fuel depots, their spherical tanks neatly arranged. It maps the zigzag trenches of the ground defense units. It counts the mobile SA-8 Gecko surface-to-air missile units parked near the runway. Every image is encoded into a data stream and beamed line by line over 100 miles of rugged mountain passes to a clandestine receiving station on the Pakistani border. On the Soviet air defense scopes, the drone is a spectral anomaly. Too small, too slow, flying too high for visual identification, and too low to register as a clear, solid return on radar designed to track high-speed jets and ballistic missiles. To the radar operators, it is a fleeting ghost, a whisper of electronic noise easily dismissed as atmospheric clutter, a flock of birds, or a minor system glitch. They filter it out. For the next 45 minutes, this ghost completes its orbit. It sees everything, and the Soviet Union, for all its military might, never sees it at all. The war began not with a whisper, but with the thunder of VDV paratroopers seizing Kabul's strategic points on December 24, 1979. The Soviet 40th Army, a mechanized leviathan of T-72 tanks, BMP infantry fighting vehicles, and regimental artillery crossed the Amu Darya River on the 27th. Their political objective was clear: prop up the faltering Communist Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, DRA government, secure key cities and lines of communication, and deliver a swift, decisive blow that would crush the burgeoning Mujahideen resistance. It was to be a limited, surgical intervention. Moscow believed the very presence of the Red Army would restore order. They were catastrophically mistaken. The Afghan terrain refused to cooperate. The Hindu Kush, a colossal spinal column of rock and ice, fractured the country into a maze of isolated valleys, narrow defiles, and towering passes. This was not the North European plain, the terrain for which Soviet doctrine and equipment was meticulously designed. Convoys stretching for kilometers along the Salang Highway or the road to Kandahar became serpentine targets, vulnerable to ambush at every turn. The Mujahideen, though fragmented into dozens of rival factions and lacking a unified command, possessed two unassailable advantages: an intimate knowledge of this vertical landscape and the unwavering conviction that they were fighting a jihad, a holy war against an atheist invader. The initial Soviet approach was a brute force application of conventional warfare. Large-scale sweep operations involving multiple motorized rifle battalions supported by armor and artillery would cordon off a valley. Helicopter-borne descent troops would land on the high ground. The goal was to trap and annihilate guerrilla bands. But the Mujahideen, employing tactics as old as the hills themselves, would simply melt away. They used goat trails invisible on Soviet maps, disappearing into caves or crossing into the sanctuary of Pakistan. The Soviet troops would then march through empty villages, facing only the sullen stares of civilians and the ever-present threat of booby traps. The sweep would end, the units would return to their garrison, and the guerrillas would flow back in. It was a draining, demoralizing rhythm of exertion without result. To break this stalemate, the Soviets turned to their overwhelming advantage in firepower and mobility, their air armada. The Mi-24 Hind attack helicopter became the iconic instrument of this strategy. 7mm Gatling guns and anti-tank missiles raining devastation on any suspected concentration of fighters. Fixed-wing aircraft like the Su-25 Grach Rook, a dedicated, heavily armoured close-air support jet, delivered brutal precision with bombs and cannon fire. High-altitude Tu-16 Badger bombers would carpet entire grid squares with high-explosive ordnance. For the Mujahideen, the sky became the bringer of death. They had no answer to it. Their arsenal in the war's early years consisted of Second World War-era bolt-action rifles, a scattering of captured AK-47s, RPG-7 anti-tank grenade launchers effective only at very close range, and DSHK heavy machine guns, formidable against infantry but useless against armoured aircraft. The Soviet pilot, ensconced in his titanium bathtub in the Su-25, or high above in his bomber, operated with near-total impunity. The psychological toll was immense. A column could be shattered, a village erased, a months-long cache of supplies destroyed, all in minutes, by an enemy they could not touch. This aerial dominance allowed the Soviets to secure their bases and major highways, but it could not pacify the countryside. By 1984, the war had settled into a grim, grinding attrition. The 40th Army controlled the day, the Mujahideen the night. The Soviets held the cities and the air, the guerrillas held the mountains, and the will of a significant portion of the rural population. It was a bloody, expensive deadlock, and in Langley, Virginia and Islamabad, Pakistan, analysts for the United States Central Intelligence Agency and Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate watched this deadlock closely, searching for a lever that could tip the balance. They identified the core of Soviet power in Afghanistan, not just its helicopters, but the entire interconnected ecosystem that enabled them, the air bases. For the CIA's Afghan task force, the problem was one of lethal precision. By 1984, through the covert infrastructure of Operation Cyclone, a river of American and Saudi money and weapons was flowing across the Duran Line into Afghanistan. Stinger anti-aircraft missiles were still 2 years from deployment, but other systems, SA-7 Grail manpads, Swiss Oerlikon anti-aircraft cannons, improved recoilless rifles were being introduced. Yet these weapons were only as good as the intelligence that directed them. The Mujahideen, brave and resilient, were not professional intelligence gatherers. In the language of satellite reconnaissance and signals intelligence, this was soft data. It could not guide a strategic sabotage mission or plan a decisive strike. The CIA needed hard data. They needed real-time photographic evidence of vulnerabilities. They needed to know which hardened aircraft shelter, HAS, housed the squadron commander's Su-25. They needed the exact coordinates of the fuel pipeline junction. They needed to count the SA-13 Gopher missile carriers on perimeter defense. This level of detail was the key to transforming the Mujahideen from a persistent nuisance into a force capable of delivering a catastrophic, psychological blow to Soviet operational confidence. But this intelligence was locked away behind a formidable barrier, the Soviet Air Defense Network, or Protivo-Vozdushnaya Oborona Strany, PVO. This was not merely a collection of radars and missiles, it was a deeply ingrained doctrine, a layered technological shield born from the existential threats of the Cold War. In Afghanistan, the Soviets had transplanted a scaled-down yet still formidable version of this system to protect their critical air nodes. The outer ring consisted of early warning radars, both ground-based and airborne, on IL-76 mainstay aircraft, monitoring for high-altitude intrusions from potentially hostile neighbours like Iran or Pakistan. Closer in, around major bases like Bagram, Kandahar and Shindand, point defense systems took over. These included SA-2 Guideline and SA-3 Goa medium-range missile systems, guarding against high-altitude threats. SA-8 Gecko and SA-13 Gopher short-range systems, mobile and lethal against low-flying aircraft and helicopters. ZSU-23-4 Shilka and ZSU-57-2 self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, forming a blistering wall of radar-guided or optically aimed 23mm and 57mm cannon fire. Finally, a network of visual observers and small arms fire comprised the last-ditch defense. This integrated system was designed to create a lethal bubble over Soviet assets. It was optimized to detect and destroy fast-moving, metallic, heat-emitting targets, jet fighters, bombers and cruise missiles. The system's radars filtered out slow-moving clutter, birds, weather phenomena, atmospheric inversion layers. Its operators were trained to look for the signatures of known NATO aircraft. Their entire mental and technological framework was built on a specific peer-to-peer threat paradigm. This created the chasm. The CIA's human assets could not penetrate these fortified perimeters to gather the needed intelligence. Satellites like the KH-11 Kennen provided stunning imagery, but they followed predictable orbits. The Soviets knew their path schedules and could hide assets under camouflage nets or inside shelters during the brief overhead window. What was needed was a persistent, loitering eye that could appear unpredictably, stare for hours, and see what the satellites missed. It needed to be something the PVO system was not designed to see, to recognize, or to fear. It needed to be insignificant. It needed to be beneath notice. It needed to be a ghost in the machine. And in the mid-1980s, that ghost was taking shape in the most unlikely of places: an Israeli garage, a small American aeronautics company, and the secret workshops of the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology. The race was on to build an eye that could see without being seen, and to wield that vision as a weapon against the world's most advanced air defense network. The concept of an unmanned aerial vehicle was not born in the deserts of Afghanistan. Its lineage stretched back to the First World War with the Kettering bug, and to the Vietnam War with the lightning bug reconnaissance drones. But these were large, expensive, jet-powered machines, more akin to cruise missiles than persistent surveillance platforms. They were not the solution for Afghanistan. The CIA needed something smaller, cheaper, simpler, and far more survivable by virtue of its obscurity. The answer emerged from an unexpected crucible: the 1982 Bekaa Valley Air War between Israel and Syria. Israel's decisive victory was enabled in part by a swarm of small, propeller-driven decoy drones used to saturate and expose Syrian Soviet-made air defense batteries. Observing the success, the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology saw potential. In 1984, they launched a crash program, adapting Israeli technology for the unique demands of the Afghan theater. The Aquila, developed by Lockheed, was a high-tech marvel. It was constructed from stealthy composite materials, featured a pusher propeller to reduce its acoustic signature, and carried a sophisticated sensor suite. It was the drone of the future, and it was plagued by problems. It was over-engineered, fragile, and prohibitively expensive. In testing, it struggled with reliability. For the harsh, remote environment of Afghanistan, where launch and recovery would be handled not by uniformed technicians but by CIA paramilitaries and Mujahideen fighters in dusty mountain valleys, Aquila was a liability. The Pioneer, however, was different. Its origins were almost mundane. Based on a design by Israeli defense contractor AAI, it was a workhorse, not a show horse. Its airframe was simple and rugged. Its engine was a modified 26-horsepower two-stroke, the kind found in commercial ultralight aircraft. Its sensor was a stabilized gyroscopic television camera, providing real-time imagery downlinked to a ground control station. It was launched from a portable rail using a solid-fuel rocket booster. It was recovered by flying it into a net, or in a pinch, by crash-landing it on its belly. It was not glamorous, but it worked. It worked because it embraced limitations. Its small size and slow speed placed it in a neglected corner of the battlefield. Its propeller-driven engine had a minimal infrared signature, making it nearly invisible to heat-seeking missiles. Its construction materials created a faint radar cross-section, often lost in ground clutter. The Pioneer's greatest strength was that it did not look, sound, or behave like a threat. It was an aerial insect, buzzing where the eagles and hawks of the Soviet PVO were not looking. In the summer of 1986, the first Pioneer systems were secretly flown into Pakistan. CIA paramilitary officers, working with select Mujahideen commanders, began training on the strange new equipment. The mission was simple: fly to a pre-programmed coordinate, loiter, record everything you see, and come home. The goal was not to shoot, but to see, and in seeing, to find a single critical vulnerability in the Soviet armor. While the technicians calibrated the drone's autopilot, the Soviet PVO operators 1,000 miles away continued their watch, their scopes tuned to the known signatures of a conventional air war, utterly unaware that the rules of reconnaissance and the very definition of a threat were being rewritten above their own fortified bases. The success of the Pioneer drone was not merely a triumph of engineering, it was a feat of human audacity and adaptation, played out by 3 distinct groups operating in the shadows of the Hindu Kush. The CIA handlers. These were officers from the CIA's Special Activities Division, often former military with backgrounds in special forces or aviation. Their world was one of covert logistics and delicate instruction. In remote training camps inside Pakistan, they faced the monumental task of teaching complex aeronautical principles to mujahideen fighters who, while fiercely motivated, often had no formal technical education. The process was distilled to its most basic physical components. The launch rail was set up on a hillside, the recovery net was erected. The ground control station, a metal box with a joystick and a small TV monitor, became the center of their universe. The handlers emphasized procedure, discipline, and patience. A single botched recovery could mean the loss of a multi-million-dollar asset and the compromise of the entire program. They worked under constant pressure, knowing that the intelligence they gathered had to be timely, accurate, and actionable enough to justify the immense risk. The Mujahideen pilots. For the Afghan fighters selected for this duty, it was a surreal leap from centuries of guerrilla tradition into the cutting edge of late 20th century espionage. They were not pilots in any traditional sense, they were operators. Their job was to monitor the console, ensure the drone stayed on its pre-programmed flight path, and manage the takeoff and landing sequences. The actual flight over hostile territory was autonomous, guided by an onboard computer following digital waypoints. Yet their role was critical. They provided the local security, camouflaged the launch sites, and bore the risk of discovery. It was a mystical tool that could see over mountains and through Soviet defenses. It granted them a godlike perspective on the enemy that had terrorized them from the skies. This knowledge was empowering, transforming their perception of the war from a defensive struggle to one where they could, for the first time, actively plan and execute strikes on the very heart of Soviet power. The Soviet PVO operator. At the other end of the technological chain sat a young Soviet conscript or junior officer in the dim glow of a radar console at Shindand or Bagram. His training was rigorous, focused on identifying the blips that mattered, the fast-moving, high-altitude signature of a potential intruder aircraft or the distinctive return of a low-flying helicopter. His radar screen was a chaotic canvas of noise, ground clutter from mountains, seasonal weather effects, and system anomalies. His doctrinal training taught him to filter this out, to dismiss slow, faint, or intermittent returns. When the faint, flickering echo of the Pioneer occasionally painted the very edge of his screen, it fit the profile of clutter, not a target. To report it would be to risk ridicule for crying wolf over a flock of birds or a thermal illusion. The system's filters, designed to eliminate false alarms, reinforced his dismissal. His psychological framework, built on the expectation of a conventional aerial threat, could not comprehend the presence of a slow, small, propeller-driven reconnaissance aircraft. He was a vigilant guard staring at the castle gate, while the spy floated silently over the wall on a piece of parchment. These 3 human nodes, separated by culture, technology, and purpose, were now linked by a single, silent, unmanned aircraft. One group sought to wield it, another to master its output, and the third remained obliviously tuned to a threat spectrum that no longer included it. This human disconnect was the drone's most effective camouflage, setting the stage for a tactical revolution built not on louder explosions, but on clearer pictures. For the first 6 years of the Soviet-Afghan War, the application of air power followed a blunt and brutal calculus. Without precise intelligence, Soviet pilots and planners relied on area saturation. A report of Mujahideen activity in a valley would lead to a mission where bombers laid down a pattern of high explosive and incendiary bombs across a grid square. Helicopter gunships would strafe likely ambush positions along a road. The goal was suppression and terror, not surgical removal. This was wasteful of ordnance, devastating to the civilian landscape, and often militarily ineffective. The guerrillas, forewarned by the sound of approaching engines, would disperse. The psychological message, however, was clear. The sky belonged to the USSR. The arrival of the Pioneer drone changed this equation at a fundamental level. It introduced the power of persistent surveillance and battle damage assessment, BDA, into a guerrilla conflict. The revolution occurred in a cyclical, three-stage process that turned intelligence into concrete tactical outcomes. Stage 1. The pattern of life. A drone would be tasked not just to photograph a static base, but to observe it over time. It would fly daily or weekly missions over the same airfield, building a time-lapse understanding of Soviet routines. Analysts, first at the CIA station in Islamabad and later with the Mujahideen commanders themselves, learned to read the imagery. They could identify when the morning combat air patrols launched. They noted the schedule for fuel truck convoys moving from the storage depot to the flight line. They pinpointed which aircraft shelters were most frequently used, indicating where the most valuable or mission-ready planes were kept. This pattern-of-life intelligence revealed predictable vulnerabilities. Stage 2. The pinpoint strike. Armed with this forensic knowledge, operations could be planned with unprecedented specificity. Instead of a general order to attack the airbase, a Mujahideen commander could now receive instructions like, at 2200 hours, the guard shift changes at the northwestern perimeter post. A gap of 15 minutes exists. A 5-man team will infiltrate here using this drainage culvert. Their objective is to place delayed action limpet mines on the fuel pipeline junction at these exact coordinates, identified by the red-marked valve. The targeting was now tactical, not geographical. Stage 3. The proof of concept. After a strike, the drone would return. This was perhaps its most psychologically powerful function, BDA. Within hours or days of a successful sabotage mission on, for instance, a runway at Jalalabad Air Base, the Pioneer would overfly the site. The imagery would show the exact crater, the damaged equipment, the repair crews scrambling. This visual proof was a force multiplier. For the CIA, it validated the multi-million-dollar drone program to skeptical congressional oversight committees. For the Mujahideen, it provided irrefutable evidence of their own effectiveness, a massive boost to morale. For the Soviet base commander, it was a deeply unsettling mystery. How did they know exactly where to hit? This cycle, observe, plan, strike, confirm, created a new and deeply unnerving form of pressure on Soviet forces. Their sanctuaries were no longer secure. The psychological sanctuary of their air bases, once considered rear area havens, began to erode. Every vulnerability, a poorly guarded fence line, an exposed fuel bladder, an undefended approach, was now potentially visible to an unseen, unblinking eye. The war was shifting from a contest of raw firepower to a game of information, where a single clear photograph could be more destructive than 100 unguided bombs. This tactical revolution, however, was only possible because of a parallel, systemic failure in Soviet doctrine, a blind spot as vast as the Afghan sky itself. The Soviet failure to effectively counter the Pioneer drone was not an accident of technology, but the inevitable result of a deeply ingrained institutional mindset. The USSR's military doctrine, its technological development path, and the very psychology of its armed forces created a perfect, unseeing aperture through which the tiny UAV flew unnoticed. Doctrinal myopia. The Soviet military was a product of the Great Patriotic War and the subsequent Cold War standoff with NATO. Its air defense doctrine, the renowned PVO Strany, was engineered to defeat two specific threat profiles: massive waves of high-speed, high-altitude American strategic bombers, the B-52, and low-altitude supersonic NATO cruise missiles and fighter bombers, like the F-111 or Tornado. The entire system, from the long-range surveillance radars to the interceptor aircraft to the surface-to-air missile batteries, was optimized to detect, track, and engage targets that were fast, metallic, and on a direct attack trajectory. The concept of a small, slow, non-aggressive platform loitering for hours solely to gather intelligence did not fit any recognized tactical or strategic paradigm. In Soviet military thinking, reconnaissance was performed by high-speed MiG-25R Foxbat jets, or satellites, assets that were themselves formidable and fleeting. The idea that the enemy's primary reconnaissance tool would be defenseless, propeller-driven, and cheap was, quite literally, inconceivable. Their doctrine had no checklist for a threat this insignificant. Technological arrogance and filtering. The hardware of the Soviet air defense network physically enforced this doctrinal blindness. Radar systems are designed with filters to eliminate clutter, false returns from terrain, weather, and wildlife. These filters are tuned based on expected threat parameters: speed, size, altitude. The Pioneer, with its low radar cross-section, RCS, and slow speed often fell below these thresholds. Its return would be processed out by the radar's algorithms as anomalous noise, never even painting a coherent blip on the operator's screen. On the rare occasions it did appear, it was dismissed. Furthermore, the Soviet military's focus was on centralized, integrated systems. They invested in magnificent, complex weapons like the SA-5 Gammon or the MiG-31 Interceptor. The Pioneer represented the antithesis of this philosophy, a decentralized, simple, and disposable tool. The technological culture that could build an orbital missile defense system ironically lacked the conceptual framework to value, or even notice, a sophisticated toy airplane. The psychology of the operator. This doctrinal and technological environment shaped the man at the radar scope. He was trained to identify known signatures and to trust his system's filters. Reporting a faint, intermittent, slow-moving contact was not seen as vigilance, but as a sign of inexperience or jumpiness. The institutional pressure was to avoid false alarms that might scramble expensive interceptor aircraft or put missile units on high alert for no reason. In a system that valued conformity and procedure, the path of least resistance and least professional risk was to ignore the anomaly. The ghostly signature of the drone became a modern-day UFO, a thing reported anecdotally by a few forward troops or helicopter pilots who claimed to have seen a small, slow plane, but which was never confirmed by the official, technologically superior sensor suite. These reports were likely filed away as hallucinations or misidentifications, victims of a psychological bias that privileged the machine's judgment over the human eye. Thus, the Soviet blind spot was a triple-layered failure. Doctrine refused to acknowledge the threat profile. Technology was tuned to filter it out, and human psychology was conditioned to dismiss it. This created a sanctuary for the Pioneer not in the empty reaches of space, but in the crowded cognitive space between what the Soviet military could see and what it was prepared to see. The drone's greatest camouflage was the unshakable Soviet belief in the omnipotence of their own peer-oriented defense paradigm. They were guarding against a dragon while the termite gnawed at the foundation. And as the termite's work produced its first visible crack, the war would enter its decisive, violent turning point. The turning point was not a thunderous battle, but the silent, methodical click of a shutter thousands of feet in the air. By early 1987, the CIA's Pioneer operations had matured from experimental curiosity to a relentless, systematic intelligence-gathering campaign. The primary target became Shindand Air Base in Herat Province. Shindand was more than a base, it was a fortress and a symbol. It served as the central logistics hub and forward operating station for Soviet air power in western Afghanistan. Its destruction or severe degradation would cripple operations across an entire region. For weeks, the drones worked. Launched from clandestine sites in the remote deserts of Farah province, they would fly their pre-programmed routes, their cameras capturing a granular, living portrait of the base's anatomy. The imagery streamed back to the ground control station where Mujahideen operators watched and was simultaneously recorded for detailed analysis by CIA photo interpreters in Pakistan. The resulting mosaic of intelligence was devastating in its clarity. Analysts could now see with forensic precision the base's circulatory system. They mapped the fuel pipeline network from the storage farm to the individual hardened aircraft shelters, HAS. They identified the specific shelters that housed the squadron leadership's aircraft marked by adjacent maintenance trucks and guard posts. They pinpointed the location of the munitions dump, the repair hangars for damaged helicopters, and the barracks for the elite Spetsnaz units stationed there for base defense. Most critically, they charted the pattern of life, the timing of patrols, the gaps in perimeter security during shift changes, the routes of internal vehicle traffic. One series of photographs, however, stood out. They revealed a critical vulnerability in Shindand's otherwise formidable defences. On the eastern perimeter, the imagery showed a section where the multiple layers of fencing converged near a dry riverbed, or wadi. The lighting was poor here, and the guard towers had overlapping blind spots due to the terrain. The Pioneer's imagery, taken at dusk, showed this area was less frequently patrolled. It was a seam in the fortress wall. This intelligence was not merely filed away, it was weaponized. In Islamabad, CIA paramilitary officers and their ISI counterparts worked with senior Mujahideen commanders from the region, most notably Ismail Khan. A complex, multi-phase attack plan was drafted, codenamed Operation Strike by the CIA. The objective was audacious, not a harassing rocket attack from a distance, but a direct, penetrating ground assault to inflict catastrophic physical damage. The plan leveraged the drone's intelligence with chilling specificity. 1. Infiltration. A crack assault team of approximately 200 Mujahideen would move under cover of darkness, using the mapped wadi as an approach to breach the perimeter at the identified weak point. 2. Suppression. Simultaneously, supporting teams would initiate diversionary attacks on other sectors of the perimeter, with mortars and heavy machine guns fixating the Soviet and DRA garrison forces. 3. Demolition. The assault team carrying satchel charges, RPGs, and flammable materials would penetrate deep into the heart of the base. Their primary targets were the fuel depot and the fully armed aircraft in their hardened shelters, as identified by the drone's imagery. 4. Exfiltration. Following a preset timeline, the team would withdraw along a pre-scouted route before Soviet reinforcements could be scrambled from other sectors or nearby garrisons. Every step was informed by the drone's unblinking eye. The Mujahideen were no longer attacking a vague, intimidating fortress. They were executing a surgical plan against a complex whose blueprints they had studied from above. The stage was set. The silent reconnaissance of the past months now demanded a violent, conclusive answer. The pioneers had seen everything. Now it was time to act on what they had seen. The night of the assault was moonless, the desert air cold and still. The Mujahideen assault force, moving with a discipline forged from years of guerrilla war and sharpened by precise intelligence, approached the eastern perimeter of Shindand. They used the wadi exactly as the drone imagery had suggested, a natural trench leading into the blind spot of the towers. Wire cutters applied to the chain-link fence at the pre-identified point opened a silent breach. The diversionary attacks began on schedule, the crump of mortars and the distant rattle of machine gun fire echoing from the opposite side of the vast base. Searchlight beams swept wildly in that direction, and the garrison's attention turned toward the audible threat. The main assault team poured through the gap. For the next several hours, they moved through the innards of the Soviet fortress. What followed was not a pitched battle, but a methodical act of demolition. Using satchel charges and RPGs, they attacked the targets the drones had highlighted. A series of deafening explosions ripped through the fuel depot, sending towering fireballs into the night sky that illuminated the chaos in a hellish orange glow. Hardened aircraft shelters were breached, and MiG-23s and Su-17s, fully armed and fueled for morning missions, were detonated in their revetments. Secondary explosions from onboard munitions tore aircraft apart, scattering shrapnel across the tarmac. The assault team, operating on a strict timetable, withdrew before organized Soviet counterattack forces could fully mobilize, melting back into the desert from which they came. At dawn, the scale of the devastation was laid bare. Soviet damage assessments, later confirmed by satellite imagery and clandestine reporting, were staggering. The CIA estimated that between 20 to 30 aircraft were destroyed or severely damaged on the ground, a catastrophic single-day loss that dwarfed anything achieved by aerial combat in the war. Millions of gallons of aviation fuel were incinerated. Key infrastructure was mangled. Shindan's operational capacity was crippled for weeks. But the true turning point, the moment that sent shockwaves through the Soviet high command, was not merely the physical damage. It was the how. The precision of the attack was inexplicable within the Soviet military's understanding of the Mujahideen. This was not a lucky mortar round or a random infiltration. The attackers had known exactly where to cut the fence, which internal roads to take, and, most devastatingly, which aircraft shelters and fuel lines were the most critical to destroy. They had bypassed strong points and struck the logistical and operational heart of the base with the accuracy of a scalpel. In the aftermath, a furious and bewildered investigation was launched by the KGB and Soviet Military Intelligence, GRU. The initial assumption was treason, a mole within the base or the DRA forces, yet no evidence of a high-level human source emerged. Then fragmentary reports from forward observers and helicopter pilots, long dismissed, resurfaced accounts of small, slow, model airplane-like objects seen in the skies prior to major attacks. The pieces began to fit together. The Soviets conducted technical analyses of their own radar logs, searching for anomalies. The faint, ignored ghosts in the machine were suddenly re-examined. The horrific realization dawned: they had been under constant, undetected surveillance. Their sanctums had been mapped by an enemy they could not see, using a technology they had not deemed worthy of consideration. The raid on Shindand was the definitive proof of concept for the Pioneer drone program. It demonstrated that intelligence, when it is precise, persistent, and properly utilized, could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to the means of its collection. For the Soviet soldier and airman, Afghanistan no longer contained any true rear areas. The psychological safety of the base perimeter had been violently dissolved. For the Politburo in Moscow, the attack was a glaring signal that the cost of the war was escalating in new and unmanageable ways. The technological surprise was complete, and its aftermath would redefine the final years of the conflict, accelerating a process of disillusionment and withdrawal that the tiny, pilotless drones had helped to make inevitable. The success of the Shindand raid sent a seismic ripple through both sides of the conflict, validating a new method of warfare and shattering the Soviet sense of operational sanctuary. For the CIA and the Mujahideen, the Pioneer became an indispensable force multiplier. The program rapidly expanded, more systems were shipped in, and training programs for Mujahideen operators scaled up. The drones were no longer a rare, experimental asset, but a standard piece of kit for planning major operations. Their use proliferated beyond Shindand. They provided the critical targeting intelligence for successful attacks on the airbase at Jalalabad, fuel depots outside Kabul, and key bridges on Soviet supply lines. The psychological impact on the Mujahideen was profound. They now possessed a smart capability that offset Soviet technological superiority. The war felt less like a doomed resistance and more like a contest where cunning and information could defeat brute force. The imagery also became a powerful political tool. Clear, time-stamped photos of destroyed Soviet aircraft were provided to Western media and congressional overseers, offering tangible proof that the massive covert aid funding was achieving measurable results. The Soviet reaction was one of escalating frustration and doctrinal confusion, but they were attempting to retrofit a solution onto a system not designed for the problem. Standard air defense missiles like the SA-8 or SA-13 were wildly overkill and financially ruinous to fire at a $150,000 drone, with a low probability of hit due to the target's small size and slow speed. Machine gun and small arms fire from the ground was largely ineffective due to the drone's operational altitude. The Soviets attempted to deploy their own counter-surveillance, using makeshift signals intelligence vans to try to triangulate the drone's control frequency, and even, according to some reports, employing trained falcons in a desperate, medieval attempt to intercept the UAVs. These measures were piecemeal and largely unsuccessful. The most significant Soviet countermove was a shift in operational posture. Bases were forced to expend immense resources on perimeter defense, diverting troops from offensive operations. Patrols were increased, guard schedules randomized, and critical assets were constantly moved in an attempt to disrupt the pattern of life the drones sought to establish. This defensive crouch was a silent admission of defeat. It consumed manpower, morale, and initiative. Every soldier now fought on two fronts, against the enemy in the hills and against the unseen eye in the sky that made his home base feel like a target. This tactical revolution, however, contained the seeds of a strategic shock that would extend far beyond the mountains of Afghanistan. The Pioneer had proven that a small, cheap, unmanned system could generate strategic effects by enabling precision. This lesson did not go unnoticed in the corridors of the Pentagon. Military began accelerating its own UAV programs, moving from niche assets to central components of battlefield awareness. The ghost that had haunted the Soviets was becoming a cornerstone of American military doctrine. The success in Afghanistan provided the proof of concept and the political capital to fund a new generation of unmanned systems, leading directly to the development of the Predator and Global Hawk in the 1990s. The battlefield of the future was being beta-tested in the skies of a 1980s guerrilla war, and the Soviet Union, in its failure to see the tiny drone, had inadvertently helped its greatest adversary glimpse a revolutionary path to military dominance. The last Soviet troops crossed the Friendship Bridge out of Afghanistan in February 1989, leaving behind a shattered nation and a bitter victory for the Mujahideen. The war's end, however, was not the end of the story that began with a silent drone over Shindand. It was merely the end of the first chapter. The technological and tactical paradigm demonstrated in Afghanistan did not retire with the Soviet 40th Army. It entered the global arsenal, its implications rippling outward to redefine modern conflict. Military and intelligence community. The Pioneer and its slightly larger sibling, the Nat 750, were the direct ancestors of the RQ-1 Predator. Developed in the mid-1990s, the Predator took the Pioneer's core concept, long endurance, real-time video surveillance, and scaled it up, adding satellite data links for global control and, fatefully, a weapons capability. The 1995 deployment of the Predator over Bosnia marked the full emergence of the unblinking eye as a standard tool of joint command. Field manuals, the find, fix, finish kill chain, so crudely pioneered with Mujahideen raiders and satchel charges, was now being automated and integrated with precision-guided munitions. This evolution reached its grimly logical conclusion in the skies over Yemen on November 3, 2002. A CIA-operated Predator, tracking a target whose movements were analysed in a pattern eerily reminiscent of the Soviet fuel truck convoys at Shindand, fired a Hellfire missile at a car carrying Qaed Salim Sinan al-Hourethi, a senior al-Qaeda operative. This was the first acknowledged targeted killing by an armed UAV outside a traditional battlefield. The tool born to spy on Soviet bases had become an assassin's rifle, controlled from continents away. The drone war had begun with all its attendant legal, ethical and strategic controversies, a direct, if distorted, legacy of the covert program in Afghanistan. For the Soviet Union, the legacy was one of accelerating decline. The war in Afghanistan was a corrosive drain, and the humiliation of being outwitted by primitive-seeming technology contributed to a crisis of confidence within the military establishment. Senior officers who served in Afghanistan returned with deep skepticism about the rigidity of Soviet doctrine and the quality of their own technology. When they witnessed the performance of American smart weapons and surveillance systems during the 1991 Gulf War, a conflict that resembled the war they had prepared for, but executed with a precision they could not match. It confirmed their deepest fears. The Afghan experience had been a preview, a demonstration that the future of warfare belonged to information, networks, and precision, not mass and attrition. This realization deepened the institutional malaise that contributed to the USSR's collapse. Finally, the drone's legacy was one of proliferation. The genie could not be put back in the bottle. The technology, once the secret of superpowers, began to diffuse. By the 2000s, dozens of nations and non-state actors were developing or acquiring surveillance UAVs. The Taliban, successors to the Mujahideen the CIA once armed, would later use commercial, off-the-shelf drones for reconnaissance and to modify into crude, weaponized platforms. The tool that had helped defeat one empire became a ubiquitous feature of 21st century conflict, from the deserts of Syria to the trenches of Ukraine, turning every battlefield transparent and every soldier potentially watched. The tiny drone over Shindand had cast a long, long shadow. It had not just gathered intelligence, it had gathered momentum, setting in motion a revolution in seeing, thinking and fighting that would fundamentally alter the character of war, blurring the lines between frontline and sanctuary, between soldier and technician, and between peace and a perpetual, silent watch. The story of the Pioneer drone over Afghanistan is not merely a tale of clever espionage or tactical innovation. It is a parable about perception and the profound costs of failing to see the world as it is, rather than as our doctrines and biases tell us it should be. The Soviet PVO Strany was a masterpiece of engineering, a shield against the anticipated thunder of Armageddon. It was designed to see the grand, the fast, the obvious threat. In its focus on the dragon, it became blind to the insect. The tiny buzzing drone existed in a blind spot, carved not out of the electromagnetic spectrum, but out of human imagination. It was a failure of vision, both electronic and intellectual. The Soviets were defeated not by a superior weapon, but by a superior idea. That in the modern age, significance could be decoupled from size and power from visibility. This blindness reshaped the landscape of power. The mountains of the Hindu Kush became a laboratory for a new kind of warfare, a warfare of information, persistence, and asymmetry. It proved that a single, clear picture could be more devastating than a barrage of unguided shells. It demonstrated that the greatest vulnerability of a technologically advanced military may not be in its armor, but in its algorithms and its assumptions. The silent shadow that drifted over Shindan was a herald. It announced the arrival of a world where battle spaces would become transparent, where sanctuary would be erased by persistent surveillance, and where the decision to strike could be made from a continent away, delivered with chilling precision. The moral and strategic complexities of that world, the dilemmas of remote killing, the erosion of privacy, the democratization of surveillance technology, are the enduring legacy of those first tentative flights. In the end, the most consequential weapon of the late Cold War was not a missile in a silo, but a camera on a slow, small, propeller-driven airframe. It taught a grim lesson, that the future often arrives quietly, looking insignificant, easily dismissed, and by the time the sound of its engine is finally recognized, the picture it has taken is already changing everything.